Good evening, everybody. This is our seventh lecture in this series. I'm going to attempt to talk about the economics of war, realizing that it's a vast subject. I'm not a military expert. I certainly don't have all the answers. But let me start off by underscoring a couple of economic thoughts that we should never lose sight of, and that they're kind of at the heart of the war issue. You may recall, those of you who attended the first lecture when we kind of introduced economics, praxeology, the study of human action. And the main principle, you could even say the praxeological imperative, is that human beings act, they choose what they value more over what they value less. So the decision to go to war, as grim as it may seem, and as not offering a whole lot of benefits maybe for some of the participants in the war, we always have to remember that somebody thinks it's in their interest to go to war or to initiate some sort of aggression that then perhaps they miscalculate and it triggers a response larger than what they had anticipated, and then you have a war. But we can never forget that people act out of self-interest and when they think they're going to get something out of it, so that's why they do it. The other economic point was a philosophical tenet of the age of mercantilism. There was a very famous French philosopher, Michel de Montaigne, who actually influenced a lot of our founding fathers. Somebody did a study, by the way, there's a little trivia here, but somebody did a study of the editorials and the sermons that were given in the colonies at the time of the beginning of the Revolutionary War, because they wanted to see whose ideas were influencing the American colonists. And Montaigne was number one of the secular authorities. John Locke was third. William Blackstone, the English jurist, was second. But more than those three combined, the number one influence on Americans was the Bible. It was a deeply Christian group of colonists who started the Revolutionary War. Getting back to Montaigne, I believe I mentioned this in the first lecture. There's this doctrine he had, or this dogma, that, and this is a guy writing in the 1500s, by the way, but he said this, quote, "No profit whatever can possibly be made but at the expense of another." That's a very grim view of the world, that we're in a state of natural conflict. If we want to get ahead, it's going to be at somebody else's expense. Now, we don't believe that today, but when you look back over human history and realize that literally for millennia, standards of living economically never got above a certain level, nor did the world's population. There seemed to be a cap on both population and prosperity, with most of the wealth being in the hands of societal elites, the nobility and the royalties in Europe. The common man had it really bad. It wasn't until the age of capitalism that a strong middle class emerged, a dominant middle class, a numerically superior middle class. But there's an international corollary. It's not just that individuals, it's not just that if I'm going to get ahead in a dealing with you, you have to suffer a loss, or you come out on top and get the gain and I get the loss. Ludwig von Mises, the great Austrian economist who was the mentor of Dr. Sennholz, who was my mentor, Mises said, and I'll quote this again, and he's talking here about applying the Montaigne dogma to international relations between countries, not individuals. Quote, "As long as the peoples cling to the Montaigne dogma and think that they cannot prosper economically except at the expense of other nations, peace will never be anything other than a period of preparation for the next war." In other words, peace would just be a time of kind of catching our breath and figuring out how to prosecute the next stage of what is essentially a never-ending war to see who can come out ahead. Thank goodness, in the last couple, 2.5 centuries, whatever, we've broken through those myths and dogmas. We've discovered economics is a positive sum activity, not a zero sum where one person's gain is offset by another person's equivalent loss. And of course, when you apply that to war, even those who win, sometimes they pay a fearsome price in terms of casualties, lost lives, that type of thing. I mean, war it's not good business. And we should be so grateful that so many people around the world have finally got it through their heads. You think back on primitive man, and one tribe would raid the camp or the campgrounds of another tribe, and steal their things. But slowly the lesson seeped into human consciousness and understanding that, guess what? We're probably better off if instead of trying to kill each other and rob each other, we peacefully trade with each other. By being peaceful, you're not going to get shot at, you're not going to get maimed or killed, but also the human being is such a productive asset. There's going to be so much more wealth produced, and we can each exchange our surplus for what other people have in surplus, and both sides come out ahead. And we see this in Europe today. It's interesting, the different mentalities of the European countries compared to Russia and China today. Russia and China, sadly for those peoples, are still ruled by people thinking the old-fashioned way, still somewhat under the sway of the Montaigne dogma, that the way for them to get ahead is through conquest. The Europeans, they're not interested in conquering anybody. They're too busy, they've taken down the borders, they share a common currency, they're enjoying the good life. They realize that they're all better off by engaging in peaceful trade. That understanding that we come out ahead by trading peacefully rather than fighting each other and killing each other, it led to a period of globalization in the 1800s, which got interrupted by World War I. I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. We'll come back to World War I in a little bit here. I think also, though, it's important to point out the fallacy where these rulers of countries, and they're the ones that usually, let's face it, the rulers of France and Germany and Spain and Italy, they aren't going to try to lead their peoples into war. The people are going to look at them and say, you're crazy. And in a democracy, they'll probably vote them out of office. We don't want to fight. We want to trade. We want to live. We want to enjoy prosperity and peace. Good point. So historically, though, most wars were fought because there was a strong man at the top. He would gain. The majority of people would probably be worse off. But the guy with the power saw himself as being able to gain, whether it be prestige or control over lands or whatever. And it's to our benefit that we understand that we align ourselves with the majority here. Peace is just better. And, I think the Europeans have definitely proven that today. But also we need to see that the Montaigne dogma is not true in terms of the countries that conquer other countries become wealthier. They're acquiring more natural resources, more assets. So aren't they becoming wealthier? Well, not really. Look at some of the economic success stories since World War II. Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, although sadly Hong Kong is losing its liberties to mainland China. What do those countries have in common? Well, Hong Kong wasn't a country, but what do those areas have in common? They're resource poor. Singapore is just a little island. Even the largest of those lands, Japan, is resource poor. It's just a rocky volcanic chain of islands. They have to import a lot of things that they need. And yet they're some of the wealthiest countries in the world. Whereas Russia, which arguably has more natural resources at its disposal than any other country on the face of the earth over that vast landmass, Russia's pretty backwards and poor. So owning resources or controlling large areas of land is not necessarily the path to national prosperity. Those resource poor countries show us that it's a matter of just having a system that protects property rights, that makes it possible for people through working hard and creating value for others and engaging in trade, become quite wealthy. So the Montaigne dogma has been exploded by the practical experience of the last few centuries. Thank goodness. Okay. I thought, we're probably going to end up talking a little bit about Ukraine later, but let's go through a quick history of the American wars. The Revolutionary War. As I say, I don't have encyclopedic knowledge of all the wars in the history of mankind, but I would wager that might be the most noble war ever fought. The founding fathers pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor in the cause of freedom. They risked it all. They could have been executed as traitors had they been defeated. But they believed in certain principles. They were motivated by the gospel to hallow human rights, the rights of life, liberty, and property. That's the trilogy that John Locke wrote about in 1694, the Second Treatise of Government, those principles of life, liberty, and property. And they're enshrined in the Fifth Amendment to the US Constitution. Jefferson modified it a little bit in the Declaration of Independence, talking about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But that's what Americans believed in. It's kind of a secular application to biblical principles. I mean, what is, you've got a right to life other than the realization of the commandment, thou shalt not kill? What is, you have a right to your property other than an application of the commandment, thou shalt not steal? So I mean, fundamentally religious roots in the order of individual rights that are protected like ours are here in America. That was just a magnificent, selfless deed that those founders did to risk their lives and everything else for the cause of freedom. Next war was the War of 1812. I'm going to tell you a couple stories here about one of my favorite Americans who's often overlooked. I'll start off, I'll give you a great trivia question to take to your next social gathering. Who was President James Monroe's opponent in the national presidential election of 1820? And if you're drawing a blank, don't feel bad, because the answer is nobody. Monroe and George Washington are the only two men that have ever been elected to the presidency running essentially unopposed. Can you imagine that today? No. Government was a much smaller influence in the lives of Americans back then. Let me tell you a few things about James Monroe. Fascinating guy. He was a freshman at William and Mary when the Revolutionary War broke out, so he went and joined the American troops. He and a cousin of George Washington were leading the advance party into the camp of the Hessians on Christmas, Trenton, New Jersey, back in, 1776. And they captured the cannons that, had they not captured them, Washington and the troops might have been decimated by those cannons. He was wounded, but even though he was wounded, he was able to maintain possession of the cannon and play an absolutely essential role in the victory of the American colonists at Trenton. While he recuperated from that wound, he made the acquaintance and developed a close friendship with another friend of America who had been wounded in battle, and that was the Marquis de Lafayette. And the friendship of the two stretched over many years. In the 1790s, Monroe was our ambassador. I think they had a different word for it back then, but our envoy to France, the US government's representative in France. And Monroe's wife was younger and very elegant. She was kind of the Jackie Kennedy of the 19th century in terms of American presidential spouses. And she was able at the last minute to save the Marquis de Lafayette's wife and mother from execution. And then in 1803, of course, we had the Louisiana Purchase, a much better way than war to expand national territory, to just buy it. And that deal was largely put together by Monroe and his contacts with Lafayette and the other people in France. You know, Monroe helped negotiate that. So he'd been a war hero. Then he negotiates the Louisiana Purchase. Then with the War of 1812, the president's James Madison, and Monroe is the Secretary of State. And the Secretary of War was inept, incompetent. I don't remember his name, but he basically ignored his job. I mean, here you've got the British troops invading Washington, D.C. But at that time, Monroe went into Madison and said, let me take care of this. So Madison made him the acting Secretary of War at the same time he was Secretary of State. And here's Monroe, now about 55, 56 years old, gets up on horseback and is on the horseback all day long, riding up and down, organizing American resistance and giving morale boosts to the troops and stuff. If it hadn't been for Monroe's leadership, we probably would have lost the War of 1812 and the American Republic would have expired. And the next thing that Monroe is known for is, besides being reelected without opposition, was that in his second term, he promulgated what was called the Monroe Doctrine, which was actually crafted by his Secretary of State, who would be the next president, John Quincy Adams. But it was this idea of spheres of influence. You know, let's stay out of the European wars, but let's tell the Europeans to stay out of our hemisphere. We just had enough entanglement with the Europeans. Monroe, by the way, what a patriot. You may recall, of course, that Jefferson and John Adams both expired on 4th of July, 1826. 5 years later to the day on the 4th of July, Monroe expired. They're the only three presidents that have passed on the 4th of July. There's only one that's been born on the 4th of July, that was Calvin Coolidge. Okay, enough presidential trivia. We get through the War of 1812. Then there's the Mexican-American War in the 1840s, where we expand out to the Pacific Ocean. And you can start debating there whether, you know, our motives were less than noble, that it was maybe, if not a conquest, well, certainly from the point of view of the Native Americans, it seemed like a conquest, but in terms of our conflict with the Mexicans, they wanted the territory, we wanted the territory, we happened to prevail. Can you find some faults with it? Probably, but we should all be grateful. And when I say we all, I mean not us, only us, but the Mexicans should be grateful that the Americans prevailed and took over Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, Nevada, California, because they flourished under the American system of laws and rights. Whereas Mexico, despite having an abundance of natural resources, Mexico has languished because Mexico had one of those old world types of government and societal structures where there was an elite and everything, the policies were always geared to benefit the elite, and the common people were just sort of expected to continue to occupy a very low station in society. You had a lot less upward mobility than you had here in the United States. That's part of the genius of the United States. That's why people try to come to the United States, and they're still coming from Mexico today. And thank goodness for them, they've got a California and a Texas, et cetera, to come to, because if the Mexicans had taken over those territories, they'd be as backwards as the rest of Mexico, and they'd be trying to come into, you know, Missouri and the Dakotas and places like that for economic opportunity. Okay, then there's the Civil War. This is a tricky one. Originally, you know, Lincoln's primary goal was to preserve the Union. And we love our country, so we think, okay, that's good. And Lincoln made the famous quote that the Constitution wasn't a suicide document. And you can still make a persuasive case that maybe the other states should have been allowed to secede. You know, after all, freedom and self-determination, although it would have been hypocritical because of the slavery issue. And it was partway into the war that Lincoln said, hey, you know what, we're going to emancipate the slaves. That wasn't the original intent, but he adopted that. And that ended up being, I think, at least morally, the whatever justification there is for the war of northern aggression, at least we put an end to the abomination of slavery. There's still something, though, that, I mean, Lincoln did suspend habeas corpus and give, you know, try to censor newspapers and so on and so forth. I mean, he behaved unconstitutionally. And I always found it intriguing. I remember hearing decades ago, I think when I was still in, I think I learned this in grade school, that in Moscow, in the Soviet Union, they had a hall somewhere with a bust of a leader, one bust of one leader from every other country. And the leader they had chosen for America was Abraham Lincoln. And I thought, well, that's odd. How could that tyrannical totalitarian government have this friend of freedom as their representative of America? But I think the reason they did was because Lincoln used military force to keep the southern states from going their own way, just as the Soviet Union used military force to keep the Baltic states and Belarus and Georgia and the stands, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, et cetera. I'm sure I'm leaving out a few, Ukraine, of course. So the Soviets kind of liked the fact that there was an American leader who used force to keep satellite states or adjacent states from becoming independent. Well, that's a controversial thing to say, but whatever. Now here's a big problem for the United States. It happens every time we're confronted with a war. Should we or shouldn't we go in? This really started, I think, with World War I. Should we go over to Europe? The uncle who raised me was the son of a German immigrant, farmer in Nebraska. He thought if we went in the war at all, it should be on the side of Germany. Now, that might sound funny, but there were a lot of Americans from Central Europe who felt the same way. And I think the dominant philosophy was isolationism. People had come to America for three main reasons: religious freedom, economic opportunity, and some of them just came to get away from those never-ending European conflicts. So it's like, why do we want to get embroiled in Europe's latest war? I mean, they've warred for centuries. They're continuing to war. That's their problem. We're America. Let's stay separate. And I can see the appeal of that. But remember, I said globalization. We were already engaging in a ton of international trade then. And both the British and the Germans were violating the freedom of our ships and their crews, trying to gain an advantage in the war. We finally decided, well, let's take a side. President Woodrow Wilson decided, well, we're going to take a side. Interesting, as the pattern that was later followed by LBJ, Wilson campaigned for re-election in 1916 about he kept us out of war. And then a year later, it's like, guess what, folks, we're going to war. That's politics for you. But anyhow, the idea was, we would reestablish a fair amount of peace and trade. Well, we didn't. We exploded trade. The first era of globalization met a fiery death in World War I. But the longer term implications were really awful. We have in economics something called the law of unintended consequences. And it should encourage leaders to be very modest in their expectations of what they can accomplish when they set out to do something. And that's particularly true for war. You don't know how things are going to play out. We thought it would make the world better. And we sent troops over, and under Blackjack Pershing, General Pershing, we had fatality rates of 70 and 80% on some of the battlefronts, that awful trench warfare and the typhus and the diseases that spread, as well as just, machine guns. It was awful carnage. But as a result of the American involvement in the war, we set the stage totally unintentionally. Here we go. Remember, we're talking the law of unintended consequences. We set the stage for future conflicts, World War II, the Cold War. Because when the Germans saw that America was going to get in on the side of France and Britain, they were fighting a two-front war. They were fighting Russia to the east, and Britain and France to the west. And they said, there's no way we can tackle all these at once. We've got to find a way to extricate ourselves from the war on the Eastern Front and put all our forces up against the Allies. Well, how are they going to do that? Well, there was a revolutionary scribbler just writing furiously away at a library in Zurich, Switzerland, a guy named Vladimir Lenin. So the Germans plucked Lenin out of the library, put him on a sealed train into Russia, gave him $6 million of gold bullion. That's back when $6 million was some serious money. And sent him into Russia because they knew he had the leadership skills to organize the resistance to the Tsar and the government there. And sure enough, next thing you know, Russia drops out of the war. Well, that was good for Germany. But we had the establishment of the Bolshevik regime, the communist state that ended up bedeviling the world for the next 7 decades. We might never have heard of Vladimir Lenin had it not been for American involvement in World War I. Unintended consequences. And so we had this monstrosity of the communist regime that cast a shadow over the rest of the 20th century, practically. Then, because our might added to that of Britain and France resulted in a lopsided victory, and that was kind of different in Europe. You know, the Europeans they'd go back and they'd forth, and one would get the upper hand, and they'd call a truce, and this one was sort of the winner, but you know, the basic balance of power remained unaltered. I mean, Alsace-Lorraine went back and forth like a football between France and Germany, but basically the European balance of power was fairly stable. Well, it wasn't after we got in and inflicted a lopsided defeat on Germany. And of course, this led to their hyperinflation, and it led to the rise of a demagogue by the name of Adolf Hitler, which of course culminated in a German rearmament in World War II. I don't think any of us would ever have heard of Adolf Hitler had the United States not gone into the First World War and inflicted that lopsided victory. So that's just a cautionary note, folks. I mean, none of us ever knows ahead of time how things are going to play out. And I think World War I gives maybe the most vivid example of that. So, okay, we have the Depression, and then we have Hitler's rearmament. The next thing you know, we're in World War II, and we had to fight it. You know, it wasn't something that, well, even then, some people said we didn't have to. The isolationists, the America Firsters, you know, and again, it was like, you can understand their skepticism. It's like, we thought we were fighting the war to end all wars, and it didn't work. Let the Europeans work this out on their own. And if Britain and France fall to tyranny, well, sorry, but that's their problem. And then, of course, Pearl Harbor happened, and, you know, no way we could stay out of the conflict. And Germany then declared war on us, and you know how it went. Interesting, though, at the end of the war, I mentioned my uncle. He had been on submarine duty in the 1920s. He stayed in the reserves, and he had 5 years of active duty. He's called up for World War II, spent 4 of those years on an aircraft carrier, the Pacific Theater. And at the end of the war, he was the one of those, he was a minority in terms of his opinion. He agreed with General Patton over in Europe that the best thing the Americans could do would be to kick the Russian troops back into the Soviet Union. They were an inferior army. Their morale was terrible. And had we done so, maybe the Soviet regime under Stalin at that time would have collapsed. And certainly the countries that fell under the Iron Curtain, you know, Czechoslovakia and Hungary and Poland and the others, they could have been free. But my uncle was called a warmonger, and I can understand why. I mean, the American people had sacrificed so much. You know, I mentioned the economics of war. Consumer spending went way down during World War II because so many resources had to go to support the war effort. And people were tired of it. And who can blame them? Who wants to keep a war going? I mean, Pop was looking at it intellectually. He understood, but the American people just weren't ready to do that. And so we let the Soviet Union set that Iron Curtain over Eastern and parts of Central Europe. And then we had to live with the consequences of that, which included, among other things, support for Mao Zedong and the installation of the Chinese Communist Party, giving them control over China, which has grown into quite a problem today. Since World War II, we seem to have entered this gray, grim, unhappy era of the no-win war. At least in the Korean War, there was some definite goal that was achieved, the line of demarcation between the North and the South. And that border has held these, 70 years now. But then we had Vietnam. That was my generation's war. Our government never did a very good job of explaining why we had to be there. The left went nuts. They exploited Vietnam very shamefully. They accused America of being on the wrong side of history. And of course, that's a Marxian concept right there, the idea that history's on some inevitable preordained path. Path toward what? Towards tyranny, towards socialism and communism. No, that's not the right side of history. We were on the right side. We were trying to preserve freedom for our allies. So don't let anybody ever buffalo you and tell you, oh, we are on the wrong side of history. No, we are on the moral side, the right side. Now, strategically, maybe we should have followed General Douglas MacArthur's advice. He said, don't ever get embroiled in a land war in Asia. And that was our problem. It turned into guerrilla war. It was awful. We couldn't even tell sometimes who the good guys were and the bad guys were. I mean, they were Vietnamese. They all looked about the same. How are you going to tell? We had tragedies like the My Lai massacre. That hit home with me. One of the kids I went to elementary school, he was in my class for several years, and I saw him at a 50-year reunion a few years back. He was one of Lieutenant Calley's troops, and he went through a hell by being part of that. It was a sad, sad war. And of course, eventually what happened is it dragged on and it dragged on, and we lost our resolve. And again, see, that's the thing. When we go back to the praxeological imperative and you say, well, what's better for me? Who's the me making the decision about war? And if it's the people, they'll usually vote for peace, like we're seeing in France and Germany today. And in America, the anti-war movement. Now, there were some people in that movement for the wrong reasons, and because they were on the wrong side, they were fed a lot of garbage at college. I heard a lot of that stuff myself, that America wasn't a very good country, and that's total bunk. But, that's what we had to deal with back then. And finally, just, the first Johnson and then Nixon did not do a good job of explaining why we had to stick it out. They never really defined what a victory would look like. There were troops that said, if our military would bomb out the supply lines coming in from to the north from China, just keep the North Vietnamese from continually being rearmed, we'll win this war on the ground. We never got to find out if they could. I suspect they could have, but we never really found out. Anyhow, things move along. Some good developments happen. The fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse and dissolution of the Soviet Union in the early 90s. Fantastic. Maybe I am not making this case. I'll preface everything I say from this point on. Remember, I do not have the wisdom of Solomon. These are very complex issues. I don't pretend to have a complete mastery of them. But that maybe we should have withdrawn from NATO slowly, gradually. I mean, Russia wasn't a threat to conquer anybody at that time. But we stayed over there, and little by little, the countries that had been under the Soviet Union sway had joined NATO, the EU, and pushing up against Russia. And I don't really have a problem with that per se. I think if the Ukrainians, for example, if they want to be free, I think they should be free. If they want to cast their future with Western Europe, if they want to trade with Western Europe, if they want to join the family of democratic nations and be part of Europe, as opposed to being part of that corrupt dictatorial system in Russia, that's their right as a people for self-determination. At the same time, Russians don't want it. And this is great. I'm actually getting along I'm moving along here faster than I thought I would tonight. I thought I had too much material for an hour lecture, but I think we're going to be able to squeeze it in. I wrote an article a couple of years ago about our adventures in Iraq and Afghanistan, where again, American troops acquitted themselves with such heroism. You know, they put their lives on the line trying to achieve their government's goals to try to build up a peaceful democratic society. But we have to ask the sober question, was that really our fight? We were drawn into Iraq because of what apparently were faulty intelligence reports that there were weapons of mass destruction. We got over there, we didn't find them. I think we could have defined victory as saying, we're going to topple the regime of Saddam Hussein. The guy's nobody's friend. And once he was found cowering in that little hole in the ground, I think we should have just turned him over to whoever, an acting provisional government over there, and gone home. Because what we did instead was stay there for, what, another 15 years, was it? I don't know exactly. Trying to build a nation. I think it was a noble aspiration. I mean, I think the intent was good and even honorable. I think Bush felt, well, we've decapitated their government. Maybe we need to help them formulate a new system. But we would never be viewed legitimately over there. That's not our country. Those aren't our people. And as we saw, we never really did have a lasting victory. I mean, hopefully, hopefully the Iraqis make a good deal of it. Similar situation with Afghanistan. The Taliban had taken control. Those are nasty, nasty people. About a decade ago, I was visiting my daughter in England, and an old high school friend of mine who was English, he'd been at our boarding school for a year. I went with him to his prep school, and there was an Afghan boy there. He was minus an eye. Najib had been a street merchant, and he and his kid brother rode their bikes to a hill overlooking the town where they lived because they wanted to see the democratic vote. America had, we'd supported a government that was trying to practice democracy, and they went to witness that election. The Taliban engaged in a mortar attack that killed Najib's brother and cost him his eye. He ended up, through the help of some very generous trustees of the college, attending Grove City College and graduating a few years ago. But his story was because of the Taliban. They're as bad as you think, and President Bush was, I think, rightly concerned. He heard the reports that they had their terrorist camps that were quite active in Afghanistan. Maybe they'd even become a base for serious weapons, whatever. So about a month after 9/11, Bush called together his military advisors, and they concocted a plan to topple the Taliban. They sent about 100 special forces, and they embedded them with different Afghan tribes. And then they would engage the Taliban in combat, because the tribes didn't like the Taliban. They weren't the popular government of the whole country, but they were just very militant. They were able to capture Kabul, the capital. So they'd engage, and then the embedded special forces would get on their walkie-talkie, and jets would fly in from an aircraft carrier out in the Gulf and get there in an hour and a half, whatever it took, and bomb the heck out of the Taliban. And they killed somewhere between 50 and 100,000 Taliban, just in a matter of months through this tactic. Well, the Taliban relented. They gave up. They evacuated from Kabul. They said, okay, the government's not ours. What did we do? We stayed there all those years trying to build a stable society, a democratic political system, etc. Again, the intent was noble, but the Afghanis have been that way for centuries and millennia, and we couldn't change them. But it cost us treasure and human life from some of our troops. It cost us hundreds of billions, if not $1 trillion. It was a very expensive attempt to make Afghanistan a better place. But again, as with Vietnam, the people grew weary of supporting it. And you have to ask, the economics of war, can we afford endless war? And we're a rich country, but I don't know that we can afford it. We talked in an earlier lecture about the spending problem, the deficit problem, the accumulated debt, because we've been overspending. And the fatal policy mix happened under Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s. Economists refer to it as guns and butter. We were fighting two wars simultaneously. We were fighting a hot military war in Vietnam, and we were fighting a metaphorical war against poverty here at home. And ever since the 1960s, the government's been, has spent, I think it's now up to $30 trillion in the war on poverty, trillions more on cronyist subsidies to favored businesses. The government just trying to run too much economically, bureaucracy here, bureaucracy there. Bureaucracies are inherently inefficient, they're money losers. You can see that with abundant evidence from our oldest bureaucracy, the Pentagon, the Department of Defense. You hear horror stories about the inefficiencies there. And then you have congressmen playing very cynical games. I can remember being so furious with some congressman from Connecticut. Oh, this must be 30 years ago now. But he was, one of the, we were on the wrong side of history and we need to be pacifists and we need to beat our nuclear submarines into welfare checks, et cetera, and our aircraft carriers into food stamps. He's one of those guys. But in his district, there was a gun manufactured that went on a particular kind of boat for the US Navy. Well, this guy, his politics was so cynical, he voted to appropriate the funds to continue production of this gun because it put people to work in his district. But then he turned around and he voted against funding the construction of the boats that the guns go on. A totally irrational military policy. And that's the kind of games that are played with the Pentagon all the time. It's disgusting. Now, the left would say, see, we shouldn't have a Department of Defense. No, I think it's too dangerous a world to go there. And my libertarian friends say, well, wait, we could privatize defense. Do you want George Soros and Bill Gates to control our army or our navy or something? I don't. So, it's like bureaucracy is costly, inefficient, wasteful, but sometimes it's the only way to get the job done. But no country is wealthy enough to be able to sustain and support the economic burden of multiple bureaucracies. And that's our problem. We've bureaucratized so much of the economy. And that's why we're hopelessly in debt right now. So anyhow, I guess that brings us up to what? Maybe Ukraine. What should we do? I don't know. I wish I did. I pray that whoever's calling the shots, and I'm not convinced Joe Biden is capable of calling the shots, but whoever's pulling the strings back there behind the puppet throne, I pray they're guided by wisdom. I don't know if any of us humanly can have any confidence that we can predict what would happen if we take this course of action versus what events would ensue from that course of action. I just don't know. Can we afford it? I mean, in terms of dollars and cents. At $31.5 trillion, it could be the straw that breaks the camel's back. If that happens, I wouldn't blame Ukraine or that war. I mean, there's a whole lot of straws that have resulted in $31 trillion of debt. But we don't have infinite wealth. And we're really pushing up against the limits. And I just was reading this week in the Wall Street Journal that We've got over 900 billion, almost a $1 trillion deficit for the first 6 months of the current fiscal year in Washington that started last October 1st. And some of that is because, the Federal Reserve, with its inflationary policy, they had to jack up the interest rates. And all of a sudden, in the first 6 months of the year, Uncle Sam spent $107 billion more on interest on the national debt than he did in the year earlier period. And because of inflation, you have the automatic COLAs, the cost of living allowances for Social Security. And so we're up $159 billion in spending on Social Security from the year earlier period. I mean, there's $250 billion just baked into the cake because of inflation. So we're not in a good place economically. I know Tucker Carlson's been in the news a lot lately. I didn't watch him very often. He certainly was a very magnetic individual, I thought, very articulate. He seemed to think that Ukraine, that we shouldn't be involved there because of corruption in their government. Is there corruption in their government? Oh, of course. I don't know how many governments in the world there are that are free of corruption. I mean, look at who we've got sitting in the White House, for crying out loud. So just because there are some corrupt politicians, does that necessarily mean that the people themselves deserve a death sentence? That they deserve to be surrendered to the not so tender mercies of the Russians? I'm not so sure about that. It's a tough one. And then I have some dear, dear friends who are just so ticked off, and I don't blame them a bit, because they say, well, look, here's Biden trying to defend the borders of Ukraine when he won't defend the borders of the United States of America. Right. That is just so wrong. But again, okay, we've got a president who's been derelict in his constitutional duty to defend the interests of America, to defend our own national border. That's gross malfeasance, if there ever was it. If it was a rational world, the guy wouldn't get any votes when he comes up for re-election, if he's the candidate in 2024. But again, it's like, do you say, so long, Ukrainians, hope you don't suffer too much before you get killed, but we got to fix our border? Or do we stay with and support the Ukrainians and do what we should have been doing all along, which is defending our own border? I guess you can probably tell from the way I phrased the question, the side I'm leaning toward. What a mess we got in Washington right now. It's indefensible what this president has done. I'm wondering if the best thing we can hope to accomplish today is some sort of a newer version of the Monroe Doctrine. 1823, President Monroe promulgates the doctrine, spheres of influence. America's sphere of influence is the Western Hemisphere. Europe's sphere of influence is the Eastern Hemisphere. The Monroe Doctrine gets chucked out the window with World War I. We cross the Atlantic. We get involved in a land war on the European continent. There's no more Monroe Doctrine. You can argue that our own decision, it was primarily the American government that deep sixed it for a while. I wonder today if we could have a Monroe Doctrine, a spheres of influence kind of arrangement where, North America, Europe, Japan, and some of the Pacific Islands, are on one side. And then you have those backwards thinking, these atavistic, these throwbacks, these brutes, Xi and Putin. They're dictators. They're not modern democratic leaders. Same with whoever the latest Ayatollah is running Iran. Maybe the thing to do is do what we did during the Cold War and practice a policy called containment. And just keep the Russians out of Europe. We don't want to go into Russia. Russia's a mess. It's so corrupt. In fact, I think that's why Putin initiated a military attack into Ukraine I think it was to shore up his popularity at home. That's the problem with war. War gets exploited by politicians. If politicians are in trouble getting the people behind them, the age-old method to turn them around and get them on your side is to conjure up a foreign enemy and fight them. So that's what Putin's doing. But Putin has been running a kleptocracy. Russia is totally corrupt. The oligarchs who own most of the wealth and the assets, they all pay off Putin. He's got more wealth than he knows what to do with, but he has to hide so he, doesn't get assassinated. I mean, what kind of a life that is? But he's dragging others down with him. He's making them all miserable. And just, saying he's got his lieutenants saying, well, we got to watch out for the Europeans. They've already come after us twice. Well, what he's referring to is, a megalomaniac by the name of Napoleon went after him more than 2 centuries ago. And then just a plain old maniac named Adolf Hitler went after him, in the 40s. Dumb, trying to go to Moscow in the wintertime. There's no Napoleon or Hitler in Europe right now. They can't even bring themselves to tax to use 2% of their GDP to support NATO in their own defense. They're too busy enjoying the easy life of the welfare state. There's no military threat there. Putin's just manufacturing that as a rationalization for wanting to conquer Ukraine, which has some of the best farmland in the world. It's a huge territory that's very, very productive, and Russia wants to control it. But the Ukrainians say, no thanks. And, Putin was saying, there's a long history between us. We're brothers. And the one brother says, the Ukrainian brother says, we don't want to be part of this system. So the other brother says, okay, we're just going to annihilate you now. Yeah, some kind of loving brother. There's no real brotherhood there. It's one country conquering another. The Russians have even been stealing art from the Ukrainian museums. They want to take all the Ukrainian art out of the country because they wanted to destroy the identity of the people, their cultural heritage. They are a separate people. It was complicated. The Ukrainian life was complicated by the fact that after Stalin had his policy called the Holodomor, where between 4 and 10 million people were starved to death because Stalin confiscated the grains and then blocked foodstuffs from going into the Ukrainian people in the 30s. Ukrainians remember that. I mean, that's burned into their national psyche. But what Stalin also did to consolidate his control of the country is he salted Ukraine, as he did with the other satellite republics. He moved a lot of Russians there. So you read about people in Ukraine today who speak Russian, and some of them are pro-Russian, some of them aren't. Some of them said, I see what's going on in Russia. I see where Ukraine wants to go. I'm Ukrainian. So, I mean, there's not a clear divide linguistically or ethnically where you got the Ukrainians all on one side and the Russians all on the other. The Russians are split. And a lot of them want to be, they consider themselves Ukrainians of Russian extraction. What would happen? And I don't have the answer, but we need to ask ourselves, what would happen if we said, this isn't our fight. The constitutional function of the United States government is to make life safe for Americans. And so we're going to forget about sending all this weaponry over to Ukraine and the intelligence reports that we share with them and the training that we give them. No, we're going to bring everybody home to defend our own border. Well, Ukraine would fall. Okay, well, that's the way it goes. That's a shame, but that's their problem. Would it end there? I think that's a huge question to ask. Or would the Russians be emboldened and say, obviously, the United States has become war weary. They're not going to get involved. So they take over the Baltics. They take over Moldova. Maybe they take over Georgia. Maybe eventually even they go after Poland. I think that would be a tough one because the Poles have been burned in the past by the Russians, and they will fight like the Ukrainians to keep that from happening again. I guess what I'm saying is I don't think there's an easy way out for us. I don't know if there's an honorable way out. I mean, how would we feel about ourselves if we pull out and let them go, and then maybe, just as Hitler was appeased. Nobody really drew the line Hitler until it was too late and you had to have the big war. And that's what, we're facing that possibility. And from what I've read, the American military forces, we do not want to engage the Russian forces directly because the Russian army is grossly incompetent, poorly supplied, poor training, poor morale. The American army would just destroy the Russian army so quickly. And then Putin's only alternative would be hypersonic or possibly nuclear weapons. And that's something to think about. Tulsi Gabbard, the former congresswoman from Hawaii, who's also a US military veteran, and she lives in mortal fear of the Russians possibly initiating a nuclear attack of some sort. The thing is, again, though, we have to ask ourselves, well, if we make it clear that we're so afraid of the nuclear thing that we'll step aside and it's like we may as well not have nukes if we're not willing to use them, just let the Russians use them, or let the Russians conquer by the threat of using them and just say, okay, we don't want to take a chance they're going to use it. So, we'll let them take over land A, land B, land C, etc. You see how complicated it gets? I try to comfort myself and say, maybe the nuclear arsenal is as of poor quality as the Russian army. Is it? I don't know. War can be very costly. Not going to war can be very costly. What is the right thing to do here? I don't know. I pray that those who make the decisions somehow are guided to do what may end up being the least wrong policy. Well, we're at 8:28, so how about we open it up for questions there? I'm not sure who's manning the phone there. Hunter, are you there manning the phone? Anybody want to? It's not necessarily a topic I imagine some of you are feeling kind of overwhelmed or just, concerned about this. Maybe the thing for us to do is to call it a night and just say our prayers for peace in the world. We'd like peace for the Russians. I do think we have to think as long as Putin and people like him are in control, they're going to be a threat. Those of you who like to read, I'll recommend a book by Bill Browder called Red Notice. Bill Browder was an American venture capitalist who had some dealings in Putin's Russia and found out just how corrupt it is. And his friend, I think it's Sergei Magnitsky, the lawyer who was going to help him, and was beaten to death. And so we have the Magnitsky legislation that was passed by our Congress. Read Bill Browder's book. And the irony there is that Bill Browder's grandfather was Earl Browder, who was the head of the American Communist Party. So the grandson became a capitalist instead. Okay, I don't see any questions popping up. So thank you for your attention. Hope I didn't ruin your evening. Let's pray in our own way. Good night. God bless.